Ensembles of the time. Before and during the Renaissance period, music was mainly composed for a cappella performances in church. Composers used the 8 church modes to compose smooth melodies to be sung in church. The major and minor scales replaced the church modes shortly after the Renaissance period because it proved difficult to write more complex, harmonious music using the church modes. Apart from the church, secular voice, also known as non-sacred music, was commonly composed. Unlike the medieval times, composers had greater freedom to publish such musical compositions. Instrumental music became more well-known during this era. However, it was mainly used to accompany other fine arts performers, such as singers and dancers. Polyphonic music came to become more popular than monophonic music after the 13th century. Polyphonic is the use of multi-versed music, which means the blending of many different melodies, whereas harmonic is the mixture of octaves to produce a rich, full sound. Monophonic music is traditionally a single melody that is used by religious subgroups. People began to use less of this during the Renaissance. Latin Mass. Any Mass celebrated in the Latin language is considered a Latin or Tridentine Mass. Latin Mass are of 3 traditional types: Gregorian chant, Latin polyphonic, or classical. Lutheran chorales in Reformed churches, it was mandatory for all chorales to be sung in unison. Gregorian chants were liturgical Catholic Church music used in the Roman Catholic Church to accompany the psalms, hymns, and prayers of the public service.
A performing musician's role in the Renaissance. How did they live? Musicians during the era of the Renaissance lived relatively indigent compared to the people who they played for in the upper echelons. However, musicians during the Renaissance began to practice new techniques in playing and performing music, particularly during the 1600s with the introduction of the printing press and the blend of both polyphonic and harmonic music, innovating and trying different techniques in performing. This innovation began what came to be classical music, changing its form from a more Gothic style, which was developed during the Middle Ages, to a more instrumental tone. New instruments also were introduced to musicians, resulting in instrumental music. Music, however, never was played with instruments alone. It was accompanied with vocalists. They were respected, but were paid quite little, often working overtime to reach the desired quotient of money to support themselves. Did musicians have fame during the Renaissance? Musicians were famous if you had connections with the church and played for nobles and higher-ups. For example, John Dowland, who was a well-renowned lute player during that time, composing and playing across Europe. He was recognized and had connections, bringing him his status. If you had connections with the Catholic Church, you usually were well-known. Many musicians weren't well-known because of the lack of communication between cities and towns during that day. Whereas now we have the internet. Composers were also far more recognized for their actions than the musicians that played their pieces, bringing with it a higher status and more wealth in general. By no means they were wealthy, though. The churches and people of the upper class hired these musicians to play for the composers. How did Renaissance musicians make their living? Renaissance musicians were employed in churches, cities, courts, and even had jobs to build instruments and print music. In the 1400s, musicians often played music in the same style of that of the Middle Ages, or the Gregorian chant. This was mainly monophonic music, which was quite dull and was used selectively for that of religion. During the 1500s, with the introduction of new composers like Jacques Desprez and Giovanni Gabrieli, and the spreading of trade and ideas throughout Europe, particularly France and Italy, brought about a different European style of music than many musicians adopted. This style was the integration of both polyphonic music, or multi-voiced music, blended with the arching sounds of harmony. In the 1600s, music and how it was accepted changed once again, with the rapid introduction of instrumental music in the case of ensembles and soloists. Musicians jumped at these new laden opportunities. That is where the age of the Renaissance ends and the Baroque period begins. Throughout the Renaissance, artists were almost entirely paid in the form of playing for religious establishments and wealthy folk of the upper class.
Created using Powtoon.